we've been moderating. I'd just like to thank both Nada and Cristina for the presentations. Very, very informative. So we're now going to address some questions. I'm sure Philippe will not mind us going past the allotted hour for anyone that wants to stay on. As mentioned earlier, we will answer all questions on the forum afterwards. But I'll just jump straight into, I think some of the questions have already been addressed. I'll start with one. The first one to the table came from Abhishek, and it's an often asked question within the sector. It would be nice to know the difference between UL 723 and E84. That was directed to Nada, but I actually think that question came in before this was covered in the presentation. Maybe just for everyone's benefit, just a quick summary of that, if you wouldn't mind. So that was the key difference between E84 and UL 723.
For non-dripping materials, it's none. Basically, for the ones that do drip, is that in UL 723 you'll have two test results, one equivalent to 84 and another one that only assesses the product until it drips and there's ignition on the floor. Okay, so that can be only 1-2 minutes or even seconds. So the results tend to be a lot lower.
Okay, second question. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, okay, cool. So a question came in from Ian Lee. This is to the panel. We are still talking about height as a tool for determining a building's risk. What is the panel's view of what other factors should be considered instead of just height?
So just to mention why height is an important criteria. In fact, it's because of the firefighting equipment. So what height up to what height can they can extinguish fires. So this is why it's depending on many countries, the definition of the height of the building. Other than that, of course, if the facade can be easily accessed or no. So can you extinguish it, or is it more difficult? Is it close to another building, or the shape is, a bit tricky to address? And also the occupancy. So is it a building receiving people? So like hospitals, schools, can you evacuate people quickly if there is a fire or no? This is also a very important criteria. I don't know, Cristina, do you have anything else to, or Peter?
I would just add also how familiar people are with the building. So it's not the same somewhere where you live or somewhere where you a hotel, where you're just staying for 1 or 2 nights. Yeah, absolutely. Occupancy is a key element.
Okay, thank you. The next question came in, it actually came from 2 different sources, from Bassam and Rami Mossa, and it was directed to Nada. They both enjoyed your presentation, and you mentioned UAE requirements for facade components. What about other GCC countries?
Okay, as per my knowledge, I know that there are no strict fire requirements in GCC countries other than UAE, but I know that some governmental buildings have preferred or have used stone wool, prefer to use stone wool or non-combustible material for that. So I know we did a hospital project in Kuwait, I think, with stone wool. But coming from the code, I don't think there's, testing requirements per se. I don't know, Cristina, do you have anything to add on that?
No.
Okay, the next question again was directed to Nada, and this came from Michal. If the UAE has one of the most advanced fire regulations, what are the causes of fires? During a recent fire, there were 7 injured persons in a 48-story fire in the UAE. Apparently, Sharjah authorities offered no immediate explanation. What is your view on this point?
So I think it's the problem of old buildings, that have been, of course, built before the fire code, because before that, there weren't any strict fire, regulation where for reaction to fire, or as well for fire propagation. So I think they have been using, combustible material like ACP panels with combustible cores, combustible insulation without proper design. So this is the problem of the old building stock, and definitely I hope there's going to be, some programs or something to do for retrofitting the facade and checking which facade has danger as per fire hazards, and trying to, retrofit it or change the product.
I think it's a very interesting subject, sort of the fire investigation. The question does actually open up a big discussion point on fire risk assessment. Obviously, buildings generally are built safe, but when people occupy the buildings, we have various imported risks, ignition sources and materials. Quite often it depends on whether the police or the fire department or civil defence are actually the investigating authority, and whether there has actually been a crime at the incident. And it may be one for Philippe and the safety design in buildings team to think that maybe a risk assessment and fire investigation topic could be very good for the audience. Moving on to, this is a question for Cristina from William. What is the difference between high-rise and super high-rise buildings?
In the UAE code?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
23 meters is generally high-rise, and 90 meters is when the term super high-rise kicks in. Buildings, skyscrapers, tall buildings, there's a whole series of different names that are used, but under definition of the UAE code, it's 90 meters for super high-rise. Question from George Manos for Cristina. Again, thank you for the great presentation. At the air gap side, can you explain when the 40 millimeter and when the 80 millimeter is valid?
Yeah, so the standard mentions 40 mm for products that have any air gap. 80 mm is for products that are self-supporting. So you would think for self-supporting a sandwich panel, they're usually thick enough that they can be self-supporting. But if something's tested as self-supporting, it would accept, any size of air gap, because 40 mm is the minimum to support any size of air gap.
Thank you very much. And another question for Nada from Roger Brooks. What are your thoughts regarding reaction to fire assessment, providing a concession that allows the glue from an ACP to be removed prior to placing the samples in the furnace? Then the products have achieved a deemed non-combustible status and are trusted as more suitable and safe product when compared to ones that have been tested to BS 8414, for instance. Quite a long question.
Yeah, I did not get the question.
I think
maybe Cristina.
Yeah. So in this case, I don't know where that assessment is coming from, but as we said in reaction fire, the thickness, the layers there are key to the performance. So I would have to see this assessment in particular, but in general, even for A2 classification, for example, you need to evaluate the thickness and the material of each layer. So for A2, I think this is very unlikely, unless that adhesive were to be, inorganic and non-combustible in some way, but it's very difficult. Reaction to fire does tend and usually includes all the layers and the product as is, because reaction to fire is fairly quick and cheap testing. So you're comparing it to BS 8414 in the question. They're completely separate assessment methods, and you need to do both, as Nada mentioned as well. But to have one instead of the other, I think that's not right.
Okay, unless I've not been keeping an eye, Philippe, on any further moderated questions. There's a couple of questions that were quite long and more sort of discussion statements rather than questions for the panel, so yeah. I won't actually cover those at the current time.
I have one from William here. He's asking if the UAE and other GCC countries mandate certification of the facade materials and components. The answer is yes. The products need to be listed in the UAE code and other countries. Let's talk Qatar, Saudi, Oman as well. So yes, products, materials, and need to be certified, and the system as a whole as well.
Okay, any further ones? I see there's one from Jebin John. Can you give a little brief about the glazing used as vertical facades and its rating specification?
I think that's for Nada. She has a fire-rated glass company.
I think for external glazing, there's no fire requirement. I mean, of course, for, you have to protect the window from fire propagation. But for the glass itself, I don't think there is a fire requirement. It's completely different for the internal glazing. For internal glazing, if you want to have fire resistance, we have that. I mean, they put 60 minutes, 120 minutes. So you have requirement of glazing depending also on the size. Is it a window glazing, near an exit of a building, etc. But for external facade, I don't think there's fire requirement.
Yeah, it only may be relevant if there is close proximity to an adjacent building and there's the risk of radiated heat, etc.
I also see a question from William regarding smoke toxicity. Of course, it's a very topical and big subject. So I would like to continue the discussion outside of the webinar and get in contact with him to discuss that. Yes,
that was one of the ones I was referring to earlier, because I think that is a big topic to discuss. And,
yes.
And again, could be a whole webinar on its own merit. Okay, I think if there's no further questions coming through for moderation, I think maybe we can just hand back to Philippe, and thank you again, Cristina and Nada, for your excellent presentations.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you very much, Peter, Nada, and Cristina. Great presentations, and I can see by the big number of participants hanging on longer than the hour that there was really interest in this. I'd like to thank the attendees for joining. And I would just like to mention that initially at the top of the chat, there's a LinkedIn group page and chat link, which you can use if you'd like to stay in touch with presenters, with your peers and the group of people that have joined this webinar. I'm just posting the links again. So there's a LinkedIn page, Safety Design in Buildings, and also a Safety Design in Buildings group, which are helpful for this. From our side, we're going to email out certificates of attendance to everyone, to every attendee. They are issued in collaboration with ICC and ASTM. We're also going to share the recording of today's webinar with you by an email. So expect an email in the next 1 or 2 days following this session. Finally, I'd like to mention we have one more module remaining in our series, which takes place next Monday, 3 o'clock, same time, same place. This will be Façade and Fire Consulting, and we hope for your continued interest. With this, I'd like to thank everyone and wish you a great day.